For this segment, we are going to be focused on those times when you're conducting research and it's not appropriate to be using an experimental design. And sometimes when you choose not to use the true experimental design, and if you recall, that's the type that has a pretty strict protocol, and sometimes when you're choosing not to use that type, it could be because it's just not feasible to conduct the heavy-duty true experiment, but other times it just isn't ethical to do so. And can you think about why it might be that conducting the true experiment, where you've got an intervention group and a control group and randomization, and people are randomly assigned to a treatment or a control, can you think of a time when maybe that isn't ethical to do? Well, if you give it some thought, you might consider, for example, how would you study whether or not smoking causes cancer? It wouldn't be appropriate to enroll a bunch of people into a study, randomly assign them to either smoke or not smoke, and then find out if they get cancer in the group who smokes. That isn't appropriate. That's not ethical behavior for researchers to engage in. As another example, how would you study if childhood abuse causes adulthood aggression? Similar to our first example, it would not be appropriate to enroll children into a study and then randomly assign them to be abused or not. So as you can imagine, there are times where we just cannot ethically conduct the true experiment. So what do you do? Well, we've already spoken quite a bit about identifying different types of research questions. And depending on what type of question you're asking, you would design a study that's appropriate to that question. So if your question is not related to causation, or if it's unethical to perform the experimental research, you may choose a different approach. So when experimental research is off the table, you might, for example, be looking at more descriptive or relational research. And again, that would be specifically when the question is designed that way. So we're looking at two different things here. Does your question mean that you are going to be doing descriptive research or relational research? Or is it the case that you really do have a question related to cause and effect, but you cannot use the experimental method? When either of those situations are the case, you would be using a different type of research study, and we're going to take a look at those in this segment. So when you're asking a research question that is descriptive in nature, meaning it is not about cause and effect, it is about describing circumstances, that is when you would use descriptive research. And again, as we move through this segment, we'll be talking about what that might mean. But just for an example, maybe you just want to observe poorly performing employees in a work unit. You already know that they're not performing up to standard. You just want to observe them to get a sense of what exactly is happening, maybe what are some of the barriers in their work, what are the events that are taking place during their day, what kind of behavior do you notice, and you simply want to describe the situation. Otherwise, you could also do something like conducting interviews to determine the extent of drug use among students. So if I gather together a bunch of students, I distribute surveys or conduct interviews, and I ask them maybe what the extent of their drug use has been. I'm not determining why they use drugs. I'm not asking questions about cause and effect. I'm not finding out what consequences they've had as a result of drug use. I'm just finding out how extensive the drug use is. And then the other example that you see on this slide is a clinical case study to explore signs of depression in teenagers. Again, exploring signs of depression is not the same thing as indicating cause and effect. So, some applications of descriptive research. Well, you might identify some important factors that could lead to speculation about association, but again, this is not telling us that one factor is necessarily associated with another. And for that reason, sometimes we describe this type of research as appropriate more for the beginning or the start of a research program. And by that I mean, maybe you begin with a descriptive question like, what's the extent of drug use among students? And once you find that out, maybe you develop a different type of question that looks at different aspects of that. But this may just give you that first snapshot to begin developing future research questions. And that brings us to relational research. So this describes how a change in one variable may be accompanied by a change in another variable. And so we find out how variables are related to one another, and we may call this correlational research, which at this point, that term may be quite familiar to you. And so if we look again at the example of poor performance among employees, maybe we find that poor performance is positively associated with supervisor neglect, that poor performance increases as neglect increases. And so if we looked at, as our X variable, the amount of time a supervisor spends with an employee, and the Y variable, the number of products made by the employee, we might find that as time decreases, the number of products decreases, or we might find that as time increases, the number of products completed or made increases. This is just a review of the concept of correlation, and so if X and Y are significantly related, we would find that it's close to either 1 or -1 when calculating Pearson's R. What's really important to note for this particular lesson is that when we find a relationship between variables, we may say that they are associated or correlated, but correlation does not equal causation. In any research methods course, you're going to learn that phrase, and you'll be instructed by anybody to make sure you remember that when two things are associated, we do not know that one caused the other. We just know that there's a relationship between them, and that's why we call it relational research. They are related in some way, but two things being related does not mean that one caused the other. That's very different. So why would you even use relational research if you can't make causal statements? Well, first of all, it's not too difficult to obtain. This doesn't require the super strict design of a true experiment, and this might suggest some information or some hints about causality, but does not directly show causality. So again, when we said that descriptive research is sometimes used at the beginning of a research program and gives us some clues about other research we might want to do in the future, the same kind of thing could be said for correlational or relational research, which is that when we find one variable is related to another variable, it might make a lot of sense to then see maybe we can conduct a true experiment and find out if X causes Y, or if Y causes X, or maybe we find out that there is no causal relationship here, it was just a correlational relationship. So if we were to ask how many people have cancer, that seems like a descriptive question. If we were to ask, are smoking and cancer somehow related, that seems like a correlational question or a relational research question. But if we're going to ask, does smoking cause cancer, now we're looking at cause and effect, and that would require experimental research. So a little bit more then about non-experimental research. Oftentimes you'll see the use of surveys. Now that could be used in experimental research as well, but a survey alone is not an experiment. These are often really good for measuring association. Oftentimes you'll see qualitative interviewing. In fact, you're seeing that more and more these days. It's kind of picking up popularity. And this is good for descriptive questions. When you simply want to describe a scenario, you may conduct interviews with individuals who we would call key informants, people who would know a great deal about the subject, and you can ask them open-ended questions and gain their insight and their knowledge. And ethnography is an interesting take on non-experimental research, and I just have an example here. This is not the definition of ethnography, but sometimes it's best to explain through example. So imagine you spent a day as a correctional officer and you recorded your observations. This is ethnography because you're not an outsider looking in. In ethnography, you become part of the study. So you're not there in a research lab coat with a badge that says, "Hi, I'm here to do research," observing correctional officers. You're becoming one, even if just for a day or a week or a month. And you record your observations as one among them. And that's a little bit different than just sitting back or looking through a window. Focus groups are popular because you can gain information from many people at one time, so they're considered cost effective. We will actually say more about focus groups in a couple slides. We will also say more about cohort studies and case control studies. So let's get there now. So a cohort study, again, some of these things are definitely best described through examples. So we'll take you through a few examples of cohort studies and then case control studies. But let's say you wanted to study what causes heart disease. Well, it's not ethical to assign people to groups and make them do things that you think might cause heart disease, because then what have you done to your poor intervention group? That's not ethical at all. So you decide, okay, in this case, I want to know cause and effect. I can't do the true experiment. The next best thing for me to try might be a cohort study. Now let me be clear. The cohort study is nice when you're interested in cause and effect, but you know at the end of this, you still really can't make a causal statement. That's really reserved for the true experiment. But this is when the question is causal in nature. So maybe you enroll a large number of people, all considered healthy at the time that you enroll them. You question them about what we call exposures, or sometimes we say risks. You find out what kinds of things they're doing. You learn as much as you can about them. And then you observe them over a long period of time, and you find out who was more likely to develop heart disease compared to those who were not exposed. So what that means is, after a long period of time, this group sort of starts to sort itself out. And you end up with a group of people who now have heart disease and a group of people who don't. And then you can kind of look backwards with that group and say, okay, among the people who got heart disease, what do they have in common? Among the people who didn't get heart disease, what do they have in common? And you see, what happens here is it's sort of natural. So rather than randomly assigning groups and saying, okay, everybody in this group's going to have to get heart disease, which of course we can't do that to people, rather than taking that approach, we let them sort themselves out. And then when they kind of form these groups, we look backwards. Another example, maybe you enroll a bunch of people in your study who are currently not incarcerated and maybe never have been. You survey them about their lives. Again, you find out as much as you can about them. And then you follow them and you see who ends up getting incarcerated. This is just like the heart disease example. We're not assigning people to, you're going to have to get incarcerated. Instead, we're letting them sort themselves out, and then when we end up with this group of people who, through life circumstances or whatever has happened to them, they end up in the group who says, yeah, actually, I have now been incarcerated. We can look just at that group of people and say, all right, so what do they have in common? What can we learn about them from all the information they gave us that might be a contributing factor to incarceration? And then we can look at the group of people who, over time, say, no, I'm still not incarcerated and I never have been, and we can look back through their information and see what they have in common. Another example here, maybe researchers gather 25 people who live near a power plant and 25 people who live far away from a power plant, and then they observe all 50 people over 20 years to see which group is more likely to develop cancer. This is kind of similar to the experimental study because we have groups, but they're not randomly assigned and there's no manipulation of variables. We didn't enroll 50 people and then assign them to either live near a power plant or not. They already lived where they lived, and so we gathered them that way and put them in groups in that way that they have kind of self-sorted, and then they sort of self-sort again when we find out who develops cancer and who doesn't. This is how it's similar, but not exactly the same as an experimental study. And again, this helps us address questions that might be related to causation without doing a true experiment, and keeping in mind that responsibly we can't make statements about causation, but we can sort of learn more about possible avenues of causation. And let me just say, I've used the term follow a few times. We follow them for a period of time. That's a term that researchers use just to mean we stay in contact with them. Maybe we continue to collect information from them. And maybe if you yourself have ever participated in a study, you know what this is like. Or maybe, every month or every couple of months, maybe every year, you get a call from the research team asking, can you come in and complete some more surveys for us? Can we ask you questions over the phone? If that's ever happened to you, you're being what we call followed, but that's a completely appropriate research term, just meaning we keep track of you and we keep tabs on you. So case control studies. This is a little bit different than the cohort study. In this case, we start out with a group of people who already have the condition of interest, and then we look into the past to see what their exposures were. So if you remember with the control study, we might enroll a whole bunch of people who don't already have the condition of interest. The examples we gave were heart disease and incarceration. So in our two examples, we would be enrolling people who either don't have heart disease yet or have never been incarcerated, and then we find out throughout the future how many of them end up with that condition. Case control study is different. We just go ahead and get the people who already have the condition and then look in the past. So actually, sometimes you can get great examples of this if you walk through a hospital and that you look at bulletin boards, and they might say things like seeking, 50 males 18 to 64 years old who have bipolar disorder. And so they might be doing a case control study. They're looking for a group of people who already have a particular condition, and then they want to learn about you. And so maybe your research question in this case is, what factors contribute to the likelihood that someone will sell drugs? Well, then you're going to be enrolling a bunch of people who already identify in this condition. So maybe they've already been identified as drug dealers. They're already somebody who sells drugs. And now you want to find out in their past what they've gone through and see if you can find any patterns that are similar among people who identify as those who sell drugs. That would be a case control study. And, in this case, again, this is hypothetical, but maybe you'll find X% of drug dealers have dropped out of high school at age 16. Who knows? You could find anything. That's why you do the study. But that might be the kind of thing that you're looking for. Like, in our group, how many of them have this same thing in common? And then finally, I'll just make a note about focus groups. I did say that we'd come back to this. And in this case, groups of individuals are interviewed to collect data using open-ended questions posed by the researcher, or in some cases, they would just call that person a group leader. In most cases, you'll see focus groups that involve like 7 to 10 people, but that really depends on the situation and who shows up and that kind of thing. But the number that facilitates discussion by all in attendance. So everybody there should be contributing in some way, and the topics at hand may shift based on who's in attendance. So although participants usually do not know one another, they are chosen so that they are relatively homogeneous, which tends to reduce their inhibitions in discussion. So we're usually not looking for the group of 7 to 10 people to all be best friends. But often one approach to running a control group is finding a group of people who may have something in common already, and so that they feel comfortable speaking to one another.